I appreciate the interest in such an important issue. We are ready to get started here. You know, education funding is one of the most, if not the most important issue that we talk about as legislators and that we appropriate for. I think it is absolutely essential that we have a global understanding of how this works, of what the state's role is in it, of how property tax plays into this, how the federal government plays into this. So this is one hearing, and there will be many others. And then the focus of this hearing is the overall funding and how it works, along with how charter schools are funded, and there will be other hearings on other topics within this realm. But we got to get started, and we need to start doing work on important issues, and that's why I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. But before we begin, I'd like to stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. Representative DeVanzo, if you'd lead us in that.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Okay. First testify. All right, so I'm going to go through here the order of how we're going to do this. We have 5 testifiers here today, and they're going to share with us how schools are funded, whether they be traditional K-12 public schools, charter schools, or virtual charter schools. And furthermore, we will learn how that funding is utilized by our public charter school institutions. Charter schools, and I'm from Beaver County, and I represent Beaver and Washington counties. And we have a rich, now I'll say, tradition with charter schools. We have Lincoln Park Charter School, we have PA Cyber, we have Baden Academy, and we've seen success there, and we're seeing more success across the nation and across the Commonwealth as well. Each testifier will share with us 5 minutes of testimony and then answer 10 to 15 minutes of questions as a panel from members that are here today. Members, if you'd like to ask a question, please just let us know, let Dan know, and if you are online, just raise your hand online. You can also ask questions from there. We'll have 2 panels of questions today, a panel concerning an overview of school funding and a panel concerning the utilization of that funding specifically for our public charter schools. For our record, we reached out to the Pennsylvania Department of Education about today's hearing, and unfortunately they were unable to join us due to the short notice of hearings, but indicated they're willing to be a resource in the future. I will say this will not be the last hearing on this subject, whether it's charter school funding or whether it's public school funding. This is an absolute critical issue that this Commonwealth is dealing with, maybe the most critical issue that we'll be dealing with over the course of the next 2 years, because ultimately it's about our children. And it's about educating our children. And that's one of the things that I think everybody should agree on that we have to get right. So this is a very critical issue. We appreciate the testifiers coming here today and talking with us. The first 2 testifiers for our opening school funding overview is Nathan Benefield, Senior Vice President from Commonwealth Foundation. Thank you for being here today. And the second testifier to join us is Michael Wisman, Founder and Executive Officer at Charter Choices. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Gale, Dan, for helping set this up. Please come and testify. Nate Benefield, I'm the Senior Vice President with the Commonwealth Foundation. Want to kind of testify today, give a high-level overview of public school funding in Pennsylvania. I know the others will be testifying more on the charter components, how those are funded, and there'll be, I think, future opportunities to talk about private schools and how those are funded and how the tax credit scholarship programs work. But just want to kind of give the high-level overview and certainly would take lots of questions if there are any. And if you stump me with something I'm not prepared to answer, our organization will gladly dive in and try and provide that later in a future time. But from the big picture, Pennsylvania ranks among the highest spending states in the nation in per student funding, nearly $20,000 per student, and as the latest numbers. One of the things that is important to note, we spend about $4,000 more than the national average in per student funding. I think one of the numbers that I've heard, a rumor out there, a myth out there, is that Pennsylvania is among the lowest spending in terms of state funding, but that's done just looking at a percentage of the total. The reality is that in terms of per student funding at the federal, in terms of federal funds, state funds, and local funds, Pennsylvania ranks higher than the national average. You know, the number that you've probably maybe heard of, like, oh, we only spend, only 39% comes from the state level, but if you do the math, would you rather have 39% of 20,000 or 45% of 15,000? Add that up, it's the bigger number is actually 39% of 20,000. That's where we are in Pennsylvania. That our per student basis greatly exceeds the national average. We're number 8 in total per student funding, and one of the reasons, if we were to be at the national average, we would really have to reduce the local spending per student, local funding per student. And Pennsylvania has been historically one of the few states that doesn't have any real caps or limits on property taxes and property tax increases at the local level. And so that's why our local share especially is significantly higher than the national average per student. Over the last several years, public school funding has grown at all levels, and certainly in terms of at the state level. And as I'm sure you are all aware, last year's budget increase was the largest increase ever for total support of public schools. This data, and there's a chart in the testimony, comes straight from the Department of Education. They have a subcategory called State Support of Public Schools. That is now, in the last budget, exceeded $14.7 billion that goes out from the state budget to public schools, directly to school districts. And this is an increase of $4.7 billion since 2014-15. So since Governor Wolf came into office, an increase of $4.7 billion. This is all inclusive. I know Governor Wolf in his own congratulatory reflections uses a smaller number. I think they exclude the increase in pension contributions that come from the state. The state pays about 52% of pension contributions for school employees. But overall, there's an increase of $4.7 billion in annual subsidies to school districts under Governor Wolf. And the two biggest line items in that budget are the basic education line item and the special education line item. While a few years ago there was new funding formulas adopted for both of these line items that were basically student-based formulas, most of the funding still flows through what is called hold harmless, that every school district is guaranteed at least the amount of funding they got in the prior year, regardless of any changes in enrollment or other factors. In the basic education line item, about 77% in the current fiscal year's budget is distributed through that baseline, and in the special education formula, it's a little less than that, 76.5% distributed through the baseline hold harmless level. And our organization has long testified for moving towards the student-based funding model. That's how we should fund public schools. It should be based on students. The hold harmless often, prioritizes buildings over students. We would encourage shifting towards more money flowing through the student-based funding formula. At the same time, with these funding increases, we've tracked, and the Department of Education reports data on school reserves. Those numbers have grown to more than $5.3 billion in reserve funds held at the end of the 2021 school year. It's a 33% increase over the last 8 years. These fund reserves consist of assigned, unassigned, and committed funds, the 3 buckets. As you know, the Auditor General has had a report last week finding that the only limit on these fund balances is school districts can only have around 8 to 12% in the unassigned fund category before they raise taxes. What the Auditor General found is a lot of them are shifting those funds around when they are coming to the vote to raise taxes, and so they're keeping very large reserves even as raising taxes. Our analysis found that nearly half of Pennsylvania school districts, about 239 of them, have reserve funds that exceed 20% of their annual spending. And I know that compares to the state, where while recent increases in the rainy day fund have been quite good, putting our state on better fiscal footing, that's significantly higher than even the goals for what we would have at the state level in terms of a rainy day fund. Another thing to note is we still have, Pennsylvania received more than $6.7 billion in federal funds over the last few years related to coronavirus relief and reopening. It still is more than half of those funds are sitting in the state treasury, have not even been distributed to school districts yet to spend. And I think that is an important thing to watch, when that money is distributed, where it goes and how it is spent, because that is one-time funding, but it is a very significant amount, $3.6 billion still sitting in the state treasury, yet to be distributed to school districts. Related to the school funding is the fact that we in Pennsylvania have had declining enrollment across the state. We've lost more than 120,000 students over the last 20 years, and at the same time we've had increases in public school employment. So there's been this talk of a teacher shortage in Pennsylvania. Some of that is because schools tend to be hiring even as enrollment is declining. And our analysis finds that while there is a teacher shortages in some parts of the state, it is not really a statewide phenomenon. We've actually had a very significant decline in the ratio of students to teachers because of this fact of while enrollment has declined, and a lot of that is simply the demographics of our state and people moving out of the state, the number of school teachers, the number of administrators has grown significantly over the last 20 years. And I think that very much is a factor in terms of how we fund public schools. And lastly, I want to touch a little bit on the funding, one of the drivers of school funding and pension costs. That is one of the more significant features in cost for school districts, that while school districts pay teachers on average about $72,000, we know that with the pension costs and largely to pay off the unfunded liabilities of years past, we're spending almost 35% of salaries go towards, or the contribution rate on top of salaries, 35% of salaries is what goes as the pension contribution rate. And you compare that to, say, a 401k plan where your matching is 5, 6, 7%. It's obviously a very significant cost to school districts. We calculated that basically the cost per teacher of paying off the unfunded liability of the pension is more than $20,000 per teacher. In other words, if we had a 401k system in place, we could increase teacher pay by $20,000 without increasing costs at all to taxpayers. That's how significant our pension liability is in terms of the cost to school districts and the taxpayers. And the last thing I'll mention is these increases in school spending have not translated into increases in student performance. We found this was a controversial finding from the Independent Fiscal Office last year of whether there was actually correlation between spending per student by districts and school performance. They found no correlation, but that's pretty consistent across the board when you look at comparisons of state spending or district spending per student, that there is very little correlation in terms of those spending and results. It's not to say that spending doesn't matter at all. We're talking about the difference between what's spending $15,000 per kid or $20,000 per kid. That is not what is driving school performance. Other factors matter much more significantly in what determines outcomes. So I wanted to bring those facts to bear. Would happy to entertain any questions later, but kind of want to have that layout. Hope that lays out the perspective on where, how much, and what we're spending.
Chairman Kale, I appreciate the opportunity today to speak to this committee and talk about how charter schools are funded. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll use, I'll reference as I go through, quickly going through this to leave us some time for questions. But on this first page, you'll see my objectives. Really what I'm trying to do here at this point is give a general overview of how charter schools are funded, currently both for regular education and the special ed students that we educate. I'll touch on some history around special education funding for districts, and then I'll talk a little bit about the 2013 Education Committee, and I'll try to stay away from duplicating points that were already made so we can get through this. Some information about myself. I am a CPA here in the Commonwealth. I've been working with charter schools since 1998, and I am the founder of Charter Choices. We're an organization that have offices right outside of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, currently representing over 60 charter schools. And before I get into the funding, one more page. Yep. I did want to share some information with the committee about charter schools and who we educate and the funding that we do receive. So you'll see on this slide here, the school district average revenue per student from this PSBA report, and this is from 2019, so it's a bit dated here, but gives you some idea of where we are. $17,983 versus $15,751. The rest of this information I think is important for this committee to see as we continue to have these conversations over the next month. But you'll see that the statewide enrollment for economically disadvantaged students in charter schools is about 63% compared to about 44% at traditional school districts. Important as we go through the funding that we read about in the newspaper and some of the court action that's happening, charter schools are actually educating more economically disadvantaged students as a percentage at this point. And as far as the race, you'll see the school districts are educating about 68% white, 32% non-white, and charter school students, 32% white and 68%. So the inverse there you'll see between school districts and charter schools. Again, important to remember as we go through the next few months. And then you'll see the teaching staff breakdown as well there. All right, Charter School Funding 101. So this first slide here will give you an indication of how charter schools are funded for a regular ed student. We begin with a number that's provided by the school districts. Current law says budgeted total expenditures. We start with that number. That'll be your gross expenditure number. And from that number, we deduct 7 expenses listed in the charter school law. So you can look here and see what expenses are listed in the law for us to deduct. Gross revenue or gross expenses minus deductions will give you a net number. That net number is then divided by the ADM, which is average daily membership. So total students within the district that are being educated. That ADM includes traditional students that are at the school districts, charter school students, preschool students. Every kid that the district is responsible for is in that ADM number. So we have a net number divided by your ADM. That'll give you the charter school regular education rate for that district. We spell it out here a little bit differently, but you'll see the same thing, right? So school district expenses less the 7 deductions gives you the selected expenditure. Selected expenditure divided by the total students, charter tuition. So we're showing it 2 different ways, but high level is total expenses minus the deductions divided by students. So for every district, there's 500 districts in the Commonwealth. We have 500 different regular education rates. The formula for special ed is very similar in a sense that we start with the total expenses for special education divided by, and this is a difference here, so we have the total ADM, again, I explained that, it's total students in the district being educated, including charter schools and preschool students. And then we multiply that ADM by 16%. So there's a 16% assumed special ed rate for every district in the Commonwealth. That number will then be divided by the total budgeted special ed costs to give us the special education rate. We add that to the regular education rate, and that's how much we will receive for a student in a charter school for special ed. One important thing I want to make sure this committee understands is there's 2 pieces to that special ed rate. There's a special ed portion and there's a regular ed portion. You will hear, and I've heard it plenty of times over the last 10 years, that charter schools are not spending all of their special ed monies. When they do the analysis, they're looking at this box here in yellow, the total revenues. They forget to remove the regular education piece, and I think that's important for this committee to be aware of. When we're talking revenues and expenses for special ed, we should be looking at this orange box. not the total. Very important for this committee to remember when we're going through these conversations. Again, we've laid it out a little bit differently here. I won't spend any time on this page as we get through it. The next page is the PDE 363. So as we continue through the conversations over the next few months, you'll probably hear testimonies about a PDE 363. This is a form that we receive from the Department of Education to do the calculations for both the regular and special ed that I've explained to you. The first side on the left hand is the formula. The right side are the deductions. I won't go through them and count them for you, but there are 20-plus deductions on this PDE 363. I mentioned the 7 that are in the law. The deduction page has 20-plus. Again, I think this is part of the conversation we'll have in the upcoming months. Now, we talked a little bit about special education, and I put this page in here specifically so that it's a reminder to the committee as we go through the next few months. But prior to 1991, way before charter schools were around, special education students in the Commonwealth were funded based on actual costs, right? And you can imagine what that did to the budget from the state and the cost for special education. There was no incentive to keep those costs down. And so eventually those costs began to grow 16 to 18% a year, and then a formula to replace this 1991 decision was put in place. But again, what I want this committee to be aware is you will hear that charter schools should be funded based off of actual special ed expenses. Let's not revisit history at this point, right? Because we know when we had that in place for traditional school districts, it did not work. It did not work for the Commonwealth. It did not work for our taxpayers. And it's something I think we should not be considering. Act 25 of 1991 replaced that full reimbursement for actual costs. 2 takeaways here, I think, that are important. The allocation at this point was based on ADM, but it was mentioned earlier, and I think this is worth repeating, so I will. Hold harmless was put in place. So to the extent a district received X amount in the prior year, they received X plus in upcoming years. The idea was we wanted to hold harmless the funding for special ed students for traditional districts in 1991 prior to the charter schools law being enacted in 1997. The 2013 Special Education Committee, or Special Education Funding Commission, came out with some recommendations. Some were enacted and was improved. I think the takeaway here for this committee is 2 parts. Again, hold harmless was in place for the school districts, so there was no funding minuses when this happened. And then all new monies went into this new formula that was enacted. So it was not historical monies. Again, hold harmless was in place. To the extent there was new monies allocated to special ed, that went into the formula. But it helped the districts sort of manage their way through this new commission finding. What was recommended for charter schools was completely different and not enacted. But on this page here, you'll see the categories at the very bottom, category 1, 2, and 3, based off of special ed expenditures for a charter school student. It was not enacted, and I have here an example of what this would do. But let me explain. Category 1 was up to $25,000 of special ed expenditures. And for that student, you would get 1.51 times the regular ed rate. So again, forget about the fact that we have 500 districts across the Commonwealth. We'll use one as an example. If your regular education rate or District A is $10,000, your additional funding for this special ed student is $5,100. That's 51% of the regular ed rate. You would get $10,000 of regular funding, $5,100 for special ed funding. Of that $5,100, you would have to spend $25,000 of special ed expenses before you could get to Category 2. Think about the math, right? We're losing funds. We're not able to educate special ed children and provide the services that they need with the $5,100. So it would put charter schools out of business. This next page here, I won't go through it because frankly, I don't understand it, but this is how the traditional school districts are funded for special ed. Ask somebody else, I don't know. All right, here's the formula. I talked about this a little bit. 363, Category 1 student, $10,000, $5,100. There's my example here. No hold harmless in place. So this is a different conversation if there's a hold harmless in place for everybody, right? So I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, but understand that the commission's recommendations, I don't think understood what this was doing to charter schools. The $15,100 in this example includes $10,000 of regular ed, $51,000 of special ed, not enough to cover $25,000 of special ed expenses. A few other recommendations by the committee. I won't go through here, but I think I've got this underlined. The hold harmless provision. Key takeaway here is that's key for both the school districts and the charter schools if anything were to change. Only new monies appropriated using the formula. I've mentioned that before. I've seen the numbers. It started at about 90% of the funding for traditional school districts for special ed was going through hold harmless, 10% going through the new formula. I think it's come up a little bit, but my point is most of the funds at this point are continue to run through the hold harmless provision, and the new funds are a small percentage of that. So we need to keep that in mind. And that's all I have for today, and I'll leave it for questions.
Thank you. And before we get to questions, I just would like to ask a few myself. But before we get there, I do want to, for the members' information, tomorrow morning there is an informal get-together roundtable with Chairman Grove and with Auditor General Tim DeFore and Treasurer Stacy Garrity. Regarding reserve funds and what they found and more information. I wanted to make sure the members knew that out of the gates. But broadly speaking here, Mr. Benefield, I would like to ask, you made a comment that resonated with me, and that was that just because you throw more money at something doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is any better. And I actually think you're touching upon a problem that's bigger than just education funding, and quite frankly, bigger than just Pennsylvania. I think legislators across the nation have gotten way too used to just trying to throw money at issues to try and solve the problem instead of actually being problem solvers. I firmly believe that we are not here to just pad the status quo, that we are here to use the brains that we have to try and solve problems. Developing that point a little bit further, where is Pennsylvania globally from all the sources of income in a national ranking as it relates to per student funding? Where do we fall in that category?
Yeah, in terms of funding per student at 20,000, we're by one ranking number 8. I've seen others that have put us 7th or 9th, but certainly in the top 10. That's based on the NCES data that has it's National Center for Education Statistics out of the U.S. Department of Education. The per student number there. I know some of our border states are among the highest. New York, I think, is near the top. New Jersey, a lot of states, Ohio is significantly less than ours, and we're about that $20,000 figure is about 4,000 more than the average state. The average state's about a little less than 16,000.
So we're number 8 as far as overall spending on
Correct.
students. Whether
from federal, state, local sources.
Where are we on test results?
Test results, we
I know
are.
that varies, but
Yeah, and it varies. On one of the things, is oftentimes very difficult to compare test results. There's the NAEP tests, and Pennsylvania scores fairly well overall. But when you kind of break down some of the demographics, we're very basically if you break it down by race, break it down by income level, we're pretty much near the average, national average.
Okay. Thank you. Chairman Greiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. On background, I spent the last 8 years on Appropriations Committee, and the education budget's always one of the more challenging ones, in addition to the human service budget. So this is really big. This is 40% or more of our budget. I guess one question I have, and getting back to that, we always struggled with we always knew we funded students at one of the greatest levels here in the country. At one point here, a few years ago, it might have been number 4 even. We were that high. What do you believe are the largest misconceptions to the public concerning how Pennsylvania schools are funded? And then just to follow up, and probably the answer might provide this, what would you like for taxpayers and we as legislators to be aware of as we try to deal with this very challenging economic issue?
Yeah. In terms of, the biggest misconceptions, I do think there is a general perception of, we are underfunded, we're below the national average, we're spending very little per student. In fact, we've seen polling done that basically asks voters, like, do you think schools are underfunded? And as well as, do you think teachers are underpaid? And they ask the same question, like, we spend $20,000 per student, now, or $400,000 for a classroom of 20 kids. The perception changes when they know the actual numbers. Same thing as do you think teachers are underpaid? Most voters just ask that question, absolutely think teachers are underpaid. When you say the average teacher salary is $72,000, the perception changes. So I think, understanding the actual information, regardless of whether you end up thinking it's too little or too much, knowing the actual facts is critical in those perceptions. And I would say one of the, to your second question, greater transparency, like having that information more public, more easy to search. Commonwealth Foundation, we made our own website basically to put out what is already available on the Department of Education's websites, but most people don't want to download 30 spreadsheets and do the analysis. They want to search for, a name and search for their school district. And so I think greater transparency would be a great benefit towards these discussions.
Transparency would be, just on background, and I do appreciate the chairman recognizing I'm going to be the finance chair this time in the Republican caucus, and obviously property tax reform is something that people back home might not realize. We really do try to tackle this issue, and it's very complex, and there's a lot of different forces there. Is there anything when it comes to that particular topic that you feel the taxpayers need to be educated? Because it's that too, why aren't you getting it done? Maybe you can shed some light on that, because I know it's coming up. Regardless of, there's been legislation over the last few sessions, and it's hard to get traction.
Yeah, I think, a couple of factors on that to note. One is, I think, the discussion of hold harmless that we've talked about, I think, ties very much towards the discussion of property taxes, in that, essentially growing districts have had a greater pinch with property taxes than shrinking districts. And districts that have shrunk because of hold harmless are still getting state funding. And so a lot of the debate over property taxes is very much a regional issue, that certain regions have had greater property tax increases than others. The other thing to note is, there's been talk of, shifting to one tax or another. I think there's been less discussion of strengthening the caps on when school districts can have property taxes. Pennsylvania has some limits, but it, before, under what was Act 1, there are limits at which a district has to go to a referendum to raise taxes, but it's only if they increase it over the threshold. I printed out this year the threshold, the base threshold is 4.1%, and then school districts have an adjustment on top of that, which average comes out to about 5.3%. So districts can raise taxes by 5.3% without having to go to a voter referendum, and then they have a couple of exemptions they can apply for on top of that. I grew up in Ohio. My parents voted on every single property tax increase in their school district almost every year or 2 years, because that's the way Ohio was set up, and some states have that. And I think requiring school boards to actually go to voters to justify tax increases would be a big benefit in terms of the transparency and the discussion there.
I appreciate that. Both gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I get into my question, I want to thank you for these policy committee hearings at a time when our chamber has been recessed pretty much indefinitely, and the doors of our chamber locked, I think having these policy committee hearings and the schedule that you've set out are going to be invaluable once we get an opportunity to actually go to the floor and do our job. So again, thank you. And Mr. Benefield, my questions are directed to you, and in a similar vein, thank you for the work of Commonwealth Foundation. You guys are thought leaders on many subjects, but in particular about school choice. And I think that's where I would like to direct my attention from a budgetary point of view. So the idea here being, especially as it relates to Lifeline scholarships and the ability for families in the bottom 15% of schools measured by performance, having the opportunity to take their children out of failing schools and put them in another situation is a piece of legislation that we considered in the last session. I assume we will do so again here. The general idea is that giving these families a choice gives them an immediate opportunity to change the outcome for that child, again, immediately, without having to subject them to a long-term solution that may or may not come to fruition. So said differently, without school choice, that family is absolutely locked into a situation. And again, we're assuming a family that doesn't have the financial means to move their child to another school in the first instance. In other words, they are locked into a school system that is failing, that absolutely subjects that child to a failing outcome. Lifeline scholarships give that family an opportunity to take their public funding to the school of their choice and immediately change the outcome for that child. In the last election, what we heard over and over and over again about Lifeline scholarships and the ability to change the outcome for that child immediately was that this was an act of defunding public schools. And I would ask you to just please answer that question, lend some clarity to why it is not, in case, defunding public schools when we just allocated historic budgetary increases to public schools in the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the simplest answer to that is, the Lifeline Scholarship Program as written last session. I know there's, other ways of doing these types of programs, but it basically took the state share of funding, allowed that money to follow the child when a child left a district school. And it basically, the numbers came down to about $6,700 per student for that scholarship, that would follow the child that leaves the public school. So in that sense, the public school would have, as I mentioned, comparing it to the $20,000 we're spending in public school per student, they would keep $13,000 without that student being in there. That's money that can be reallocated for the current students, allowing funding to increase per student funding. And that's, there have been numerous studies of the finances of school choice programs, from scholarship programs like the Lifeline program, the ESA type model, tax credit scholarship programs, basically all showing those programs benefit not only the students who receive a scholarship and get their choice, but the public schools, because of the fact that in most cases those programs are significantly less per student, providing savings for the district that they allow to reinvest in the students who remain behind. And so they've shown, both in terms of the finances and in terms of the outcomes of public school students, those programs are actually benefiting both categories of students.
So if I can just recast both my question and my understanding of your answer, which is to say, in a class of 100 students, if one were to leave and take a portion of their public funding with them, it is truly only a portion of it. So that class now has to pay for an education for only 99 students, but it has public education funds from the state and the federal government that exceed that which is required for 99 students. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Administrator Delozier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know there's a number of folks that have questions, so hopefully I have some quick questions just for some clarity. I represent Cumberland County. It's the fastest growing county in our state. And so my issue and question goes to hold harmless. Because our students are, people are moving into our area, which is great, but our schools are bursting at the seams. And because of hold harmless, my question directly to Mr. Benefield is the fact that, is there a number that we can say, if hold harmless was eliminated tomorrow, how much money would be sent to follow the student to districts like mine in Cumberland County with Cumberland Valley and West Shore and Mechanicsburg that are bursting at the seams because we're getting new students. Since those other districts are not educating the child, if those dollars actually followed the child to the school district that is educating them, do you have any idea, have we been able to understand what that number is that would be sent out into those growing school districts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers for each individual district at my fingertips, but I can get that fairly quickly. Okay. From the larger sense, I do have the 25 largest, fastest growing districts in the state are getting, on average, $4,600 per student in state funding. The 25 shrinking districts are getting, on average, $12,500 per student. There's an $8,000 per student, $8 per student difference between the shrinking and growing districts, and that's basically the impact of hold harmless.
Okay, thank you. And real quickly, Mr. Weissman, can I ask you about enrollment? I looked at your numbers here, and you have percentages, which is helpful, but do you have the numbers exactly? How many students in Pennsylvania, there's 500 school districts, do we have a number of how many K through 12 students there are?
So I don't have that information with me, but I certainly could share it with the committee once I get back to the office as part of the calcs.
And I appreciate it, because the percentages in and of themselves, my question would be, how many are there K through 12? How many are actually in charter schools? Because that would affect your percentages. When you're talking about economically disadvantaged and just the breakdown of race and income levels.
Sure.
So the number of students that are in K through 12 in Pennsylvania, how many are in charter or cyber, and how many of charter cyber special education children?
We can provide that.
Thank you very much.
Representative Brinkavich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Benefield, I want to go back to the discussion of transparency as it relates to the stockpiling of funds. You had quickly mentioned that last week the Pennsylvania Attorney General, Tim DeFore, released an audit that uncovered a legal standard practice where school districts found a way to use the law to their advantage and always raise taxes. At times, these districts showed nearly $400 million in uncommitted funds, but shifted over $100 million into capital fund accounts to become eligible for higher tax exemptions. Out of the 12 schools that were studied, the audit reflected 37 tax hikes in 4 years, and our Auditor General called it a shell game using taxpayer funding. Before our legislature takes action on this, I want to ask you, can you explain why these school districts would want to push these tax increases onto Pennsylvania families? Is there something they're scared about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a tendency to try and raise taxes as high as they can every single year to maximize the revenue and to avoid ever having to go to a referendum. And part of that has been this shifting of funds around or shifting of the reserves to get around and find a loophole in that to stay under the threshold, allowing them to raise taxes. And even though, as the auditor found, and I think Commonwealth Foundation would agree, that a lot of these school districts have adequate reserves and should be using that first before going to taxpayers for more funding. And I think the response from a lot of the school districts has been, well, this is legal, it's a common practice. I think the Auditor General had said, and I would agree, that well, maybe it shouldn't be legal, maybe the law should be changed to crack down on that reallocation of reserve funds and require school districts to use that first before raising taxes.
Now, did you read the Auditor General's recommendations for what the legislature should enact to try to solve this problem? And do you agree with that?
Yeah,
that
largely
plan of
agree with
action?
them. I think having more strict standards on those reserve funds and how they are accounted for, and they're making it more difficult to just shift them and keep them off the books for tax increase purposes.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Chairman Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. I always found it interesting that sometimes public schools, regular public schools, they'll criticize the performance of charter schools, and they'll say, oh, only a certain percentage of the students are at grade level in math and reading and stuff like that. But then when you look at that public school, their numbers are even worse. So it's just kind of funny. Well, it's not really funny, but in Erie that just happened. Erie School Board is trying to close down a charter school in Erie, and if they use the same standards for their own public schools in the Erie School District, they'd have to close their own schools down also. But I was wondering, is there a practical way that you could think of, like if some school district has 90% of the students are proficient in math and reading and everything, they don't usually have a lot of students going to the charter schools. But if some school district has 10% of the students proficient, 15% of the students proficient, a lot of those students end up going to charter schools. Well, then that charter school might only have, 50% of the students proficient, but that's a lot better than the 10%. So has the Commonwealth Foundation looked at that? Is there a way to have some kind of weighted average or some kind of index number so you can compare, where those students came from and where they're at now? Even if a charter school had 89% of the students proficient, if they're coming from school districts where 90% are proficient, they're going backwards. But it seems like they're all going ahead, not backwards.
Yeah, and I think there's I think we'll note the Stanford Credo study did this analysis, and a lot of people pointed to the top line figures, but what they found is that charter school students in charter schools were outperforming the schools that they were compared to, where the students were coming from, generally speaking, by several points in terms of academics. Again, as mentioned, with less money per student that charter schools get than traditional public schools do. That indeed, when you look at the areas where traditionally charter schools are in urban areas, and typically where public schools are performing worse, that's where they've set up, that they are indeed doing better than the districts of origin, the schools of origin. And I would add to that, Representative, that, our organization does believe that, yes, bad charter schools should be shut down when they're not performing. I think that's one of the virtues of charter schools. They have a charter that can be revoked at any time. One of the problems we're seeing, though, is school districts are not creating new opportunities. So while they should shut down low-performing charters, they should also be allowing new ones to grow and allowing successful ones to expand. And there's been a lot of limits and caps on that have basically prevented that from becoming an actual marketplace the way it should be.
Then one final question. When it comes to higher ed, there's virtually 100% agreement among the public, Republicans and Democrats, when a student is attending post-secondary education, they should be able to take their FIA state grant. They could go to Penn State, they could go to Gannon, they could go to Westchester, they could go to Carnegie Mellon. They can go wherever they want to with that money. That's their share of the money. They can go wherever they want. But just a few months before that, when those same students are seniors in high school, oh my gosh, we can't have that kid picking a school 2 schools away from where he lives. He has to go to that exact school. That's terrible that he could take his share of the money. But then a year later, when the kid's in college, oh yeah, go 300 miles away, anywhere you want to with that money. Do you have any thoughts? Why does the public have that thought? And what could we do to change that opinion? Because that doesn't seem to make any sense.
I think, my own opinion, based on the polling that we've done and seen, I think the public actually agrees with that students should be able to choose the best school that fits their needs. I think what you have, though, is in the higher ed, everyone's used to that, and basically the universities are used to that. They've had that system in place. In the public school system, you have institutions that have not had that and are very resistant to that change of basically let's keep students limited to their neighborhood zip code assigned school to prevent that competition, prevent breaking up that basically that system that they have in place, and that is often putting the interests of the adults in the system ahead of the interests of the students and the families.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your thoughts. I do appreciate that.
Representative Diorsi.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and for both of you for your testimony. I suppose this question is for Nathan. It's my understanding that polling has been done to measure public opinion on school choice in the Commonwealth, and it's also my understanding that it's quite popular. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to the analysis you've seen and what the numbers say.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that we've seen lots of polling on educational choice and whether money should follow the child, giving parents control of their child's education. That is overwhelmingly popular, and it's bipartisan across the state. Certainly, in a lot of the urban areas, even more popular than in some of the rural areas because they have seen that and have greater desire for that choice. It is certainly a very popular issue in Pennsylvania and across the country. And I think We're seeing that now. A lot of states where they are in the legislature is in session and holding voting. I've seen Utah and Iowa just passed universal school choice, following where Arizona and West Virginia are. Those are states that are moving well out ahead of Pennsylvania, and my hopeful optimism is that Pennsylvania can catch up in the years ahead.
Representative Gleim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick question. So we've all seen data that school funding doesn't necessarily reflect academic performance. And I've seen all of the things that are included in the basic ed funding formula. And we also know that there's some inefficiencies that are happening within schools and the decisions that they're making with their own budgets. But would you support including academic performance factored into a funding formula?
It's an interesting question. I think so. It's you kind of hear this about paying for performance. I think some of the factors in the basic education funding formula are kind of perverse incentives rather than incentives for performance. I think that generally, as you give more choice to parents, empowering them with it and allowing the funding to follow the child, I think that helps address the academic concerns that, if parents are choosing the school and the money follows them, that will, the better schools will thrive. Money will follow, performance will follow then as students are they're competing for parents moving with their feet, voting with their feet, if you will. I'd be curious to hear suggestions of how to incorporate kind of that pay for performance. I think that tied into the basic funding formula. Curious to see how that would work and play out. But certainly, I think the fact that it isn't tied to it. In fact, what we often see is, when you hear this about charter schools or private schools, like, we need to have more accountability. Whereas in traditional public schools and school districts, it's often, well, if they're low performing, then they must need more money, and we're throwing more money at schools that are, not performing. That seems to be the wrong solution, rather than forcing reforms on them. I think maybe even tying funding formula to policy reforms that we know are school reforms within the school that work better. Maybe requiring some of the governance changes within those schools that are continually low performing.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to I happen to know, like CASA, just in our area here in Harrisburg, which is the Capital Area School of the Arts, they are graduating like 98% of their students, and they're performing very highly. And you would think that somebody that is doing that well would, get maybe something separate in these funding formulas when the kid, from the school districts that are sending their kiddos there. And I agree that a lot of the kids that school districts are sending to charters are usually doing better because of the area that they're coming from. The school districts are not performing well. So you would think that, in the funding formula, they would get more money for performing higher than their school district that they're coming from. So that's where I was going with that, and I do believe that the funding formula needs to be looked at sooner the better. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative. And that is all the questions that we have right now on the list. I will note for the members that if you have additional questions, please feel free to email myself or my Executive Director, Dan Hagan. I will also note that we are running a little bit behind, and it's mainly my fault, but we would like to make sure that we get the next group of testifiers in and give them the ability to have their testimony and for us to ask questions. So Mr. Benefield, Mr. Wisman, thank you very much. We appreciate both of you offering yourselves as resources, and we will continue to reach out and get more information and have a better understanding of these issues. Thank you. All right, our next panel. We have 3 testifiers in this panel. It's a school funding utilization panel. Our first testifier is Lawrence F. Jones. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Richard Allen Preparatory Charter School. The second is Beth Jones. She is the Chief Operating Officer and the interim CFO at Insight PA Cyber Charter School. And our third testifier is Mr. Brian Hayden, who is the Chief Executive Officer at PA Cyber. Thank you all very much for being here. Mr. Jones, if you'd like to begin, I'd very much appreciate it, and we'll have all three of you testify, then we'll collectively ask questions, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Larry Jones. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Richard Allen Preparatory Charter School, one of the founders of the school. We started in 2001. I've also been involved in various advocacy groups in Pennsylvania since 2006. I say all that to say that I've been around for a while and I've seen a few things. I can promise you that I'm not going to use a lot of numbers as my previous panelists provided, but I'll tell you a little bit about what I see as how these things impact charter school operators on the ground. One of the other things I'd like to do is kind of come from a different perspective. I said I've been around for a while, and one of the changes that I've seen is there's a word that we don't use a lot when we talk about education these days. It used to be used all of the time, and that word is children. We just don't talk about children as much as we used to. Talk a lot about regulations and funds and all of these other things, but I think that as educators, we need to be more child-focused. So talk a little bit about how these things impact us on the ground. You may have heard the analogy of a young individual who has a six-figure salary and can barely live check to check, and they always go to their grandmother or grandfather to borrow a few dollars because that individual is able to sustain and save and have what they're able to do financially. I think the point of that is that it's not always about how much money you have or how much money you're getting, but it's how that money is distributed and how that money is used. So I'm very jealous when I hear our previous panel because I don't know what hold harmless means. As a charter school, if our enrollment declines, if something happens this year, next year we don't get that same funding. Also remember, the charter schools are funded based on the previous year's expenditures. So if there's a huge spike in 1 year, we don't get the benefit of that spike, but the cost of living and all those other things and any emergencies that happen, like a pandemic maybe, we wouldn't expect that. Those things happen real time, even though we're operating a year behind, but we're still able to make things work. We talked about fund balances. We talked about the $5 billion plus fund balance that school districts have. But again, if charter schools are funded on expenditures, not revenues, then that revenue over expenditure is never seen or accessible by public charter schools, or more specifically, the children that they serve. So we hear this dynamic of overfunded charter schools, underfunded districts, and it just seems odd to me that if you start to look about how things really shake out, it seems it might be the other way around, but you don't really hear the charter schools running around saying, give us more money, give us more money. What we're saying is the money that we're receiving, let's make it fair, and let's enable us to continue to use those funds without the restrictions that were put on us by the law. The law was created in many ways to loosen charter schools up, to be innovative, to not have to work within those same restrictions. What we've seen over the years is those restrictions have been placed upon charter schools. Charter schools, a movement that was supposed to reform education, have now been, the reformers are being reformed to look just like what they were supposed to reform. I don't know if I can say that again. I think it made sense. It's the right thing, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So when we look at the things that are happening in charter school funding and education funding, we see a segment of schools that are educating a disproportionate number of minority students, a disproportionate number of students in poverty. They're doing it with less funds. They're doing it without bond intercept provisions. They're doing it without construction and facilities funding. They're doing it. And maybe the question of why we see all these tax hikes is it might be that that money is going to a lot of adults. Second thing I'd like to say about when we talk about charter school funding is asking the right questions. One of the questions that I've been asking lately is, when that money comes into a school or a district, those public funds that are generated by children who are sitting in the seats, do those funds actually get used in a way that will ultimately help the communities from the children, where the children reside? So for example, at the charter school where I work, our employees mirror the students. The money that comes into our school, we make sure that through contractors, through employment, through other things, that we are really sensitive within the confines of the law, that the money is actually having an impact not only on what we want to spend, but the people who are getting it. So what does that look like? It means that you may have a vendor who normally couldn't get a contract in a school district because school districts are prohibitive for a lot of small vendors, but they can get a contract for a charter school. And that may not seem like anything important, but if you're a child whose neighbor now has a business and you see that person coming in and out of your school, that makes a huge difference. And it also makes a difference when we multiply it by 87 schools or 170 schools, or even put that out into school districts. So there's a number of things that we see happening within the educational funding system. We keep talking about how much schools are getting, but I think we need to also look at how they're spending it, how they're being innovative, and who the money is going to. One of the other things that we hear a lot about, that we've talked about, is the special education funding. And again, you can get a lot of numbers and you can see how much money comes into a school, but one area that we always don't talk about is the nuances in schools. So I'm at a small charter school. I'm a certified administrator, I'm an educator, and many times if there's a special education issue, I may be involved in that. I may bring my expertise, I may bring my experience, but we do not say, hold on a second, let's take a percentage of Mr. Jones's salary and let's code that to special education. And that's replicated in charter schools by many different positions. And a lot of times that allows us to be a little bit more efficient in our overall functioning, but we don't capture all of those things. And so if we were going to capture those things, what we'd have to do is go out and hire another individual to track all of that information and become less innovative and less efficient, spend more money, just so that we could explain why we deserve the lower amount of money that we're getting. I won't stay on special education too long, except to go to one very important issue that hasn't been touched upon, and that is when we talk about special education, we talk about the services that are provided to students. We should get all of the resources needed, especially when we're talking about students who have disabilities, students that have additional challenges. And there is a system in place in Pennsylvania to help those students. In 1971, intermediate units were created. Intermediate units were created in 1971 to replace county superintendents. It's a system, there are 29 intermediate units. In Philadelphia, the intermediate unit in the district with the largest number of charter schools, we get very few, if any, services from our intermediate unit. That's not this year, that's not last year, that's every year. And so what are the services that we should get? Anything from professional development, to training, to support, to hiring teachers, to placement for students with behavioral or other disabilities that the charter school just can't serve. There are a plethora of services that our schools don't have access to, which means our children don't have access to them. And that is a problem. We did a survey, and we found that 79% of the schools surveyed in Philadelphia indicated that they didn't receive services from the intermediate unit. That intermediate unit is funded by state dollars with a mission to support those schools. The reality is, across the Commonwealth, the amount of services that are going to charter schools, brick and mortar or cyber, who are serving students with disabilities is up and down. It is so bad that oftentimes in places like Philadelphia, we have to go to outside intermediate units to purchase the services that we should actually be receiving. Again, how is the money being spent? And so, again, 1971 intermediate units were created. 26 years later, in 1997, there was a joint governmental task force or commission to study intermediate units and how they should function. 26 years after their inception. Also important about 1997 is that was the year that charter schools were created. So if you look in the intermediate unit law, if you look in the report that was put out there, the word charter does not exist, which means that we weren't thought of. And it's been 26 years since 1997, and perhaps we could actually have some efficient funding if we took a look at that system and looked at that before we look at special education funding. It's a system of accountability. And then finally, when we speak about accountability, you often hear that charter schools are not accountable. I shared with you documents about the vast accountability measures that we have in charter schools, and over the last 22 years, I have seen those deliverables double, if not triple. And what that means is, what that means is that for schools like mine, smaller schools, independent schools, we don't have the staffing or supports to deal with that. And so you may say that's not a big deal. What does it mean? Well, if there's a national study that shows that smaller schools, independent single-site schools that are overregulated, and that's what this has come to be, are often closed prematurely, they are not open, and most of those schools are serving poor students and minority students. And why is that important in Philadelphia? As I close, if you look in Pennsylvania, if you look at Philadelphia, about 20% of all charter schools in Philadelphia are minority operated, and the vast majority of those are independent single-site schools. 87% of all schools that have been recommended for any type of closure or action are minority-operated schools. The same schools that employ larger amounts of minority teachers, the same schools that often employ their students, the same schools that have parents going to them for a slightly different reason. The representative asked about having academic outcomes. I think we should have academic outcomes, but we have to look at what the outcomes are. Our parents know what they want, and they aren't always measured by the same exact test. I went to Morehouse College, and our SAT scores didn't measure up in many places, but the number of Rhodes Scholars that we produce, we compete with everyone. So I say all these things to say that there are some serious issues that are going on with how the money is being spent, with how accountability is being doled out to charter schools, and all of that is impacting the way a student can enjoy his or her time at the school that their parents and they have chosen. So I'll answer any questions, but I thank you very much for your time.
Ms. Jones.
Good afternoon. I'm Beth Jones. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Interim CFO at Insight PA Cyber Charter School, and I am the President of the Board for the Pennsylvania Coalition of Public Charter Schools. I thank everyone here for the opportunity to share information with you about charter schools and about my school specifically. A little bit of background about me. My career in education started over 30 years ago as a kindergarten teacher in a traditional public school district. And since then, I've taught all ages, from toddlers to adults, including time as an adjunct instructor at a Pennsylvania community college. I've been involved in the charter school movement since 1998, just a year after the law was passed. I'm a founder of Collegium Charter School in Exton, and I served as its COO until 2017. At Collegium, we opened with just 39 students on day one, and when I left, we had close to 3,000 students. Beginning in 2018, I started work as the CFO at Insight PA Cyber Charter School during our school's first year of operations. I'm now at COO, and we've experienced unimaginable growth since we opened. We had just hundreds of students our first year, and now we have over 4,000 students today. Whenever I speak to folks about charter schools, I always include a few basic facts. And forgive me if you're already aware, but I think it's important to set a common baseline. Charter schools are public schools. Charter schools are non-profit entities. They are not for profit. Charter schools do not charge tuition. Charter schools operate on less funding per student than traditional district schools. Charter schools have enrollment. We do not have admissions. Unlike private schools, we cannot select the students who enroll in our schools. Cyber charter schools do offer full educational programming along with plenty of opportunities to engage socially, to build connections and friendships. Charter schools typically serve more students from economically disadvantaged families, tend to have greater diversity amongst their students, and typically enroll more students with special education needs than our traditional school districts. And charter schools are held accountable by the parents who choose our schools and can choose to walk away if they're not satisfied, by our authorizer who grants our charter and monitors our performance, and by the Department of Education through a myriad of required reports and compliance monitoring programs. So now that you've indulged me with the basics, let me share a little bit about Insight PA Cyber Charter School. Insight PA first submitted our charter application in 2014 after years of work by our founding board. Our application was denied by the PDE in 2015, and our appeals process began. That process took over 2 years before the Commonwealth Court of Pennsylvania ruled that the Charter Appeals Board must direct the PDE to issue Insight PA a charter. Our origin story and the related delays, costs, and frustrations are not uncommon in Pennsylvania when trying to start a charter school. Unfortunately, the process of authorizing or granting a charter to allow a charter school to open rests with the public school district in which the proposed charter is located, or in the case of a cyber charter, by PDE. So think about it this way. This authorizing process for the brick and mortar schools is akin to allowing the McDonald's of the world to permit or deny the opening of the Chick-fil-A's. That doesn't happen, and it shouldn't happen in education. And for us cyber schools, the political winds in Harrisburg often determine how receptive or combative the folks at PDE are. Public education should not be a monopoly, nor should it be subject to the pendulum swings of politics. Insight PA's differentiating factor is our career pathways programming. While many schools are talking about career readiness and alternatives to traditional four-year colleges now, this was not the norm when Insight PA was established. Families were hungry for an alternative that would allow their children to learn online and prepare for the post-secondary career or education that was most meaningful to them. While career readiness education begins in our elementary grades, it is in our high school program where students can select a career pathway in business, health sciences, or information technology, with an education pathway in development to launch next school year. In addition to the courses available in each of these pathways, we also have a number of partnerships with organizations across the Commonwealth that provide pre-apprenticeship opportunities for our high school students. And these opportunities vary. Some provide virtual courses, others a hybrid in virtual and in-person programming. Many include in-person, hands-on experiences, and successful completion of some programs can lead to nationally recognized career credentials. I'd like to tell you about one of our high school students. We'll call him Nathaniel. Nathaniel is a senior who has special education needs. He expressed interest in a construction career. His school counselor worked with him and his family, and this led to Nathaniel being accepted into the Keystone chapter of the Association of Builders and Contractors pre-apprenticeship program. Along with his academic courses, Nathaniel works through virtual career-related courses each day, and 1 day a week participates in a hands-on Safety 360 training. He learns about all the trade areas: electrical, HVAC, carpentry, sheet metal, heavy equipment operations, and plumbing. And when Nathaniel completes the program at the end of this school year and passes all of his associated exams, he will earn his pre-apprenticeship certificate, his OSHA 10 certificate, and his National Center for Construction Education and Research card. This card is recognized across the country and will align to an apprenticeship in any of the trades that I previously mentioned. Nathaniel will be career ready at graduation. In addition to the partnerships for pre-apprenticeships, Insight PA also partners with the Bender Leadership Academy, a Western Pennsylvania-based nonprofit with a mission to increase long-term competitive employment for youth with disabilities. We're the only cyber charter in the state to participate in this program, and some of our high school students with special education needs are participating in this Leadership Academy. This program provides the students with a mentor to help the students transition to the workplace and provides a comprehensive approach to addressing the barriers to employment that some students with special needs face. One of our high school participants, we'll call her Charlotte, was recently invited to give a speech to the Bender Board of Directors. This public speaking experience provides Charlotte with an opportunity to share information with the program leaders about her experiences and increase her confidence related to addressing adults and groups. The Bender program provides a positive social media environment for its students, allowing them to connect to program alumni and leaders in the disability and business communities. The program assists students in developing career goals that align with competitive career opportunities, develop a network of peers and mentors, as well as help the students develop pride in being a member of the disability community. Each of the participating students earns a $1,000 scholarship upon successful completion of the program, and the scholarship can be used to help them achieve their career or educational goals. Our students who complete this program will be prepared to access additional education or enter a career after their high school graduation. I share these anecdotes to illustrate the comprehensive nature of our school's programming. We are well beyond the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the obvious. There are costs associated with offering the extensive programming that we and all the charters and cyber charters across the Commonwealth provide. So, when your conversation turns to proposed cuts to charter school funding, which it always seems to do come budget time, please keep Charlotte and Nathaniel and the over 170,000 students in Pennsylvania charter schools in mind. Without sufficient and fair funding levels, we couldn't do what we do to educate and prepare our students. So I thank you all for your attentiveness, and of course, like Larry, I welcome all your questions when we're done.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Mr. Hayden.
Good afternoon, Chairman Kell and members of the Policy Committee. My name is Brian Hayden, and I'm the CEO of the Pennsylvania Cyber Charter School. On behalf of our 11,000 students and their families, thank you for holding this hearing on educational funding. At PA Cyber, we say that the learning never stops. In our 22nd year of online teaching and learning, we are one of the oldest and most experienced cyber charter schools in Pennsylvania and the United States. We are proud of the work we do to ensure that every student has the opportunity to succeed in the classroom, the community, and workforce. Unfortunately, there are those who want to convince you otherwise, that we are greedy, uncaring, and provide a poor education that does not prepare for students for the future. I am here to tell you there is no truth to that. Any effort to find common ground on reform must be rooted in a shared set of facts. And in the past, there was a significant disconnect between the perception of cyber charter schools and the reality of cyber charter schools. Every time an organization, news outlet, trade association, or an elected official misrepresents the reality of cyber charter schools, the discourse needed to create meaningful reform is harmed. We, as cyber charter school educators, accept some of the responsibility for these misconceptions, as we have clearly not been as effective as we need to be in educating policymakers and the general public on how we operate. But I would suggest that the blame is equally shared by those who make unfounded statements and accusations about cyber charter schools in an effort to sway public opinion. In order to dispel some of the most common misperceptions about cyber charter schools, let me state the obvious. We are not private schools, as some have stated. We are public schools and we do not charge tuition. Cyber charter reimbursements are calculated by each of Pennsylvania's 500 public schools districts and reflect the investments that taxpayers make in students. Our families are also taxpayers, and they deserve the same investments for their kids' education. Tax dollars do not belong to school boards. They belong to the students who most directly benefit from them, regardless of where they choose to attend school. Because we receive public funding, we are held to the same standards on how we spend that money as other public schools. If the intent to have a constructive dialogue about how to best reform the system to benefit all students, I welcome this opportunity to meet with the Republican Policy Committee to make sure that we eliminate these falsehoods and misperceptions. I also believe that it is critical that policymakers fully understand and recognize the difference between a cyber program and cyber school. It is commonly stated that it costs a fraction of what we are reimbursed to educate a student in a program. Yet this ignores the fact that we are comprehensive public schools. At PA Cyber, we have over 800 full-time employees, including 300 Pennsylvania certified PSEA teachers, principals and other administrators, advisors, counselors, a business office, large tech teams, and others who support our students and their families both in and out of the classroom. We have buildings in Midland to accommodate both our staff and students, 9 regional offices and staff across the Commonwealth, hundreds of extracurricular activities like prom, school newspapers, STEM education, field trips, and dozens of clubs. We provide every student with laptops, laptop cameras, printers, and when needed, internet connectivity. Cyber programs and cyber schools are very different, and we have very different resource needs. To be specific, PA Cyber passed a budget anticipating $170 million in revenue for this 22-23 fiscal year. We budget about $12,500 per regular education student and $24,000 per special education student. Of that amount, $160 million is generated from school district reimbursements and the remainder from various state and federal programs. $116 million is devoted to instructional expenses and $58 million for administrative support. At PA Cyber, we do not have an educational management organization or charter management organization to whom we pay any public money. Also, except for the initial round of COVID relief money, ESSER 1, in the amount of $2.4 million, we have returned additional rounds of this funding, totaling tens of millions of dollars to the PDE. That must be part of the $3.6 billion that a previous panel spoke of. We believe we are very responsible stewards of public money. I do want to take a few minutes to address special education students. We have over 2,300 special education students with IEPs that we must fully accommodate, including $2 million in unreimbursed transportation costs. As a point of information, the vast majority of our students who come to PA Cyber already have an IEP developed by their previous public school. In fact, over the past 14 years, we have only identified an average of 65 students a year as qualifying for an IEP. This is another fact that is contrary to the false narrative by some that we are purposely monitoring these students for financial gain. As some policymakers have proposed a standard statewide reimbursement rate to provide equity, this discussion should include equity in funding for all public schools, not just cyber schools. If policymakers can ensure that every traditional public school in Pennsylvania is funded equitably, then the issue of different cyber school reimbursements will disappear. Until this occurs, cyber families should receive the full benefit of the taxes that they pay to educate their kids. It is simply unfair to argue that a student attending a cyber school is worth less than if she or he stayed in the school district. PA Cyber is committed to raising the quality and respect of the dialogue on this matter, and we would welcome any interested party who commits to the same. Reform is needed and can be achieved through working together through the lens of honesty, fairness, equity, and transparency. Thank you again for allowing me to participate in today's hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Hayden. Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, gentlemen, I appreciate the testimony from all three of you, specifically Mr. Jones and Mr. Hayden. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that special education funding issue. I've heard that in the past that that charter students or cyber charter students are denied access to IU services, and you mentioned that in your testimony. Can you touch on that?
Yes. So I'll speak specifically about Philadelphia, but it's a problem that persists throughout the Commonwealth at varying degrees. Philadelphia, the intermediate unit, one of the problems is that unlike the other IUs, the Philadelphia School Board is the intermediate unit board. So if you go to a Philadelphia School Board meeting, there's times when they'll say, okay, right now we need to stop and become the intermediate unit, and they make those decisions. It's kind of weird. We receive a monthly meeting. We receive, maybe there'll be a training about a reporting issue, but none of the hardcore resources that other IUs like Montgomery County, Springfield County, Delaware County, we don't receive any of those resources. So we either are buying those resources from private vendors or we're going to the other IUs to purchase those resources. we're not even talking about shared expenditures and all the other things that we could do. We just don't have access to those resources.
And we're in all 67 Pennsylvania counties of PA Cyber, so it's a mix. There's some cooperative IUs, there's some less than cooperative IUs, and that's not just in special ed. For instance, where I am in Beaver County, the superintendents of schools will not allow us to come to the superintendent's meetings. So the poor IU director, in the morning, he meets with the 13 public school superintendents. In the afternoon, he meets with the 4 charter CEOs. Not sure why that, I know why that is, but that's kind of where we are. But it even goes beyond the IUs. Like in transportation, I talked about, we have $2 million of unreimbursed transportation costs. When Mike Wisman did the presentation and showed the exceptions, well, transportation is one of the things that traditional school districts can deduct, which makes sense for most cyber students because they don't actually go anywhere. But for special ed students, they go somewhere, right? Many of them. In a school district, if Beth and I live next to each other and we both have kids who are in special ed, and let's say go in Beaver County, the place is called New Horizon, which is a school for exceptional kids. The school district can pick up her kid who goes to the Beaver Area School District, drive right past my house, and go up the road to the IU. Even if we offer to pay that school district, they won't do that. They will not do that. So then we go out and hire an additional company, some other provider, to essentially do that same thing. And I've said from a business model for these school districts and IUs to turn down our money to do the services that they're designed to produce or to provide is ridiculous. And imagine, I mean, some of you are from rural counties. Imagine trying to provide, special ed services in very rural counties. There's one brother, sister, I'm not making this up. I think it's something like $67,000 a year we spend to take them to a day program for special ed. And if an auditor ever sees it, it's a limousine company. I hope the kids aren't in a limousine. I'm assuming it's a van. But there's no public transportation. There's no Uber. There's no, other way to do that. So we contract with a private company to take these kids to their therapy sessions every day.
So staying in that world of the IEPs, and at times we'll hear from our public schools that a student may have one IEP assessment, and then if they leave, they get maybe an elevated assessment, or the charges that the district is receiving for the IEP service is higher. Would that be possibly connected? Because if I'm understanding you, some IUs are refusing to allow you to participate in those services, so you're having to set up your full support structure independently, and that's some of what those cost differences?
The law requires every time a student transitions schools to have a review of the IEP. Yeah, you have to do that. So the law requires that review. It's not like it's something we're doing for fun or because we want to make money. It's a requirement.
It's more the change in the assessment.
Right, yeah. So once that happens, then you have the family involved. And the number one reason that special ed kids leave their school district to come to PA Cyber is they're not satisfied with how they're being treated within the traditional school district. So, again, and I've said this a lot of respects, you never argue with a mom, right? And if they come in and want a review of an IEP and they want to talk about additional services, we don't grant those immediately or regularly, but we have to review those. But again, everything that's in that IEP, we have to accept as a minimum. And like I said, we're a very large school. It's something like 97% of the IEPs have come to us. We're not just looking for students and saying, oh, geez, I think we could make an IEP here and double our revenue. That's not how that's happening.
In the area of the IEP information, would it be beneficial, or does it already happen, that a public school's IEP assessment and a cyber or a charter school's assessment are shared? Are those professionals sharing that information, or would it help in cost containment?
So when the student comes, their IEP, all of those documents should come. So I'll say should come. And that's another issue. If those documents do not come, so pendency, once that child is enrolled in our school, if the sending school is slow to provide the IEP, if the parent can't get to them, we don't have a roadmap of how to educate this child. So that's when we would have to do our own evaluations so that we can develop an IEP with the families. And there's two things to that. Number one, there are often times when the reverse happens. You'll always hear that the charter school inflates all of their services. There's many times that we get a student, and we're serious about that least restrictive environment, that we will look at a child and say, we think that we can program for this child, and we don't have to be as restrictive as we were before. Let's take a look at this, and a lot of times parents like that. And then the last thing I'd like to add is the way that this ties into accountability. So if we're hearing that there's an entity that provides oversight, that can take your charter, but they also have the impact to not provide the resources for the same items that they provide oversight over. That's unethical. That's just blatantly unethical, but it happens consistently.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Schlegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think early in the presentation, Mr. Jones, you had made a comment, which I'm kind of interested in. I'd be interested in hearing a couple examples relative to charter schools were designed to implement reform. And it kind of suggested, I took from your presentation, that that has been diminished over time. And I was just wondering if the panel could elaborate on that just at least a little bit.
Sure. So the first example that comes to my mind, we can all agree, I think, that some measure of standardized assessment is important to kind of be able to compare apples to apples across the Commonwealth. However, there was a big shift at some point in my career. I'm so old, I can't remember exactly when it was, but sometime probably in the late aughts or early teens, when standardized testing really became the be-all and end-all, and that was around the same time that our country was experiencing, I don't know if we called it a recession, but the mortgage crisis and the bank bailouts and all of that. And so those two things coupled together led to a lot of schools focusing on teaching to the test and being required to move towards testing proficiency rather than offering the full complement of courses. So it led to cutting music programs, cutting art programs, sometimes reducing the amount of history or civics education that a student would receive. So that's the first example that came to my mind when you asked that question.
I would also say that we have things like in Philadelphia, they call it Epicenter, and the number of submissions that we not only have to make, but have to make sometimes repeatedly. How many times can you submit your 501c3 determination letter? It's kind of once you get it the first time, you know you have it, right? But beyond that, it also looks at, again, the smaller schools. So when you come into a small charter school, the Human Resources Office, well, that's kind of in my office. And some of the legal compliance office, that's also in my office. And sometimes if we have a problem with a certain student, that's in my office also. And if you increase all of the reporting requirements, you're now saying to a small school, or really any school, you have to hire somebody to deal with that. And if you can't hire someone to deal with that, then either you may look like you're not in as much compliance. And so again, one of the articles that I attached from Johns Hopkins talks about that and the impact not only on smaller schools, but on all schools. And it means that we can't focus on doing innovative things with our students and our staff.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Administrator Delosier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully, I just have a couple quick questions. One goes to the idea of many of the schools, public schools, have been able to start their own cyber charter school. Can you talk to the point that the charter schools that they are starting with the online, that they can do that for less money than it costs to go to pay you guys?
I'll start, and then, but I'm sorry, but both Brian and I, it's our instinct to kind of correct that terminology, and I'm sorry that we interrupted you, but school districts are starting cyber programs as a pathway within their overall school districts. We are purely cyber schools, so everything that we do is done virtually for our students and for our families. And then we also do have some, in-person social and community building engagements. And there is a big difference because in our school, we have all of the related expenses to providing a comprehensive education that the school district has as well, but they just don't embed those costs in their cyber program. They're over here in their traditional school district budget, not in their cyber program budget.
Which they would have anyway, whether the child went to their program or your program. So that money is already accounted for. And you're saying would be over here, that would be in their budget anyway, because then they'd be paying you for the child to go to a different type of cyber. So I'm just trying, that was just one of the issues that it gets brought up with public schools.
If I might add something to that, I'm sorry not to interrupt. Beyond the means of teaching, right, the environment, the teaching, if you talk to our families, and, I'm blessed, right, I get to go around to our 9 offices and meet with our families in person, talk to them. They aren't leaving the school to be cyber students. They're leaving the school because they were completely, totally dissatisfied with the school district they were in. Somebody once said to me, the first decision these families make is to leave the school. The second is where to go. And, the fact that they have a cyber program that lets kids learn at home is not what the parents want. They want out of that school district. And, sometimes you'll hear superintendents and school board members say, we have no idea why the kids left. I'm like, okay, I got 10,000 stories, and I will be happy to tell you why the families left. And it had nothing to do with the computer. It was the services, it was the attitude, it was the decisions, it was the administration, the leadership of that school district that made the students leave. So it is not an even comparison or a fair comparison for those families.
Okay, and I know that a lot of those individuals, when they leave, if they go to the school program, they obviously were comfortable with that in going to that program. So, and those that come to you guys, absolutely, they made their choice, and I think that's why we need school choice to have that option. But there are some that are, and I know my school districts have started those, that's why I was asking. And my last question just goes to, if a child comes in chooses to come to one of the cyber charters, and then you go and do your evaluation and have them have an IEP, do you have any connection back to the school district in talking about that fact? Because the school district now has to pay for that additional expense. So I'm just trying to understand the communication that might happen between you changing the curriculum in which that child would need to have for whatever purposes, and that might be valid. Just, is there communication back with the school district that now has that additional bill?
Yes. With the first time that a newly identified special education student at a charter, when first time we send that bill over to the tuition bill over to the school district, we would send a page from the IEP that outlines the sort of the headlines of that cover page. But the school district could always ask for more information. If they receive that and they have questions about it, they ask for more information. We would then provide them with whatever documentation they would need to satisfy their questions.
But that's if the parent permits it, if the family permits it. Remember, the IEPs are driven by the family. So if the family doesn't want that communication to go back to the school district, because they're no longer a student there, they're a PA Cyber student or an Insight student. So the parent can restrict that information, because the same way that they couldn't send it to you or to anybody else. And many
Even though that school district is accountable for that child.
But they aren't. No, we are.
Well, no, but I mean, they're accountable in the sense of testing, they're accountable with all the conversations.
They are our student now. They no longer belong to that school
district. But they graduate from the high school.
No, they graduate from us. They get a PA Cyber diploma. They're no longer they're no longer.
My understanding was dual, like both of them.
No.
So a charter, easy way to think of it is a charter school is also in Pennsylvania an LEA, local education agency. Not every state has that. So you can think of us almost as a school district of one school, some more. So when that child leaves Cheltenham Township School District and comes to charter school X, they are in ostensibly a different school district. There can be some communication, but at that point, we are now responsible for providing services. And we may look and say, we've had instances where there have been children who have intellectual disabilities that were receiving only speech services. And we're like, how does this happen?
Okay.
Right? And then we've also had times where we'll get a student that has enormous services and we're like, why? And so we're responsible for meeting with the parents, for having our psychologists do evaluations. That's all on us. If that child leaves our school and goes to a district school, same thing. They go right back to the district.
Okay, no, I appreciate the clarification because the ability to have that accountability was always one of the issues with the testing, with the decisions and everything else. So I appreciate the clarification. Thanks.
Thank you.
And the other issue too is the liability, right? Because we're the people who get sued because they're our student. So we're not going to share decision-making with an entity that can't be sued. I mean, to be perfectly blunt.
Without permission.
Without permission, right? So that's rarely happened. And again, at PA Cyber, most of our families want nothing, and I literally mean nothing, to do with their previous school district. Nothing at all. Yeah.
Chairman Griner.
I didn't hear Griner. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. It's kind of funny, through all the discussions today, you know, I said earlier that I was on Appropriations Committee. We know the biggest drivers in public education are salaries and benefits and pensions. You talked today about, sounds like you got legal fees, sounds like you got transportation issues. You know, what is your biggest, when you look at the charter schools and cyber charter, what are your biggest cost drivers in that regard for your schools?
People, I mean.
Yeah,
our
So
biggest-
it's still going to be the people.
Yeah, right. Salary, like I said, we have union teachers and others, so we're paying them, you know, on scale with traditional public school teachers. I think last year our PSERS bill was something like $18 million, just our PSERS bill. So, you know, you add healthcare and everything else in there, that's what it is. It's people.
So the cost drivers are analogous with what it is in the public schools. I thought maybe there might be something separate or different that, you know, from what it is in public education. So
We do have a little bit of flexibility related to the pension program. Traditional public schools, their employees must be in PSERS. Charter schools can go through a process, and instead of offering PSERS pension, we can offer what's called a mandatory 403B. And so that leads to huge cost savings. We have, at Insight, we only have 20 of our 450 employees that are in PSERS. So if there's anybody hired that is still with us during our first year, but one of the first big projects I took on as our CFO was for all new hires, we are in 403B, and that saves us about 31 cents on every dollar, because instead of sending 36 cents on every dollar earned to PSERS, we send 5 cents to the 403B. And we have found that it has not been a detriment to recruiting.
that's great information. Well, I appreciate all three of you being here today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Marcel.
Thank you very much for joining us today. First, I just wanted to mention I really appreciated Mr. Jones' comments about being student-focused, because I think that that's something a lot of times that's left out of the conversation. The question that I had for all of you is that there was discussion about school boards approving charter school applications. And so the question to you is, if a school board is not the body that is approving it, who do you suggest should be reviewing that in the community?
There's a lot of models across the United States of independent authorizers. So it could be, you know, maybe as simple as the state university system plays a role, or perhaps there's, just like there's a charter appeals board in Harrisburg, perhaps there is a charter authorizing board in Harrisburg. I think there's probably other great examples too.
So this one is a Larry Jones suggestion, not to be attributed to anyone else, because I'm sure there's other organizations that wouldn't like it. I understand that one of the concerns also is that a local school board would feel that they should have some semblance of local control. And so one of the things that we often see is the decision to accept or reject an application, just like the decision to renew or non-renew a charter, is based upon the evaluation that takes place. So if there was a truly functional IU service, that could actually be independent enough to take on the service of evaluation. And if it was a third-party independent that evaluated a charter and said, this charter school should most definitely be approved. If that district then said, we're not going to approve you, when the charter school went to the Charter Appeals Board or to court, it would be very difficult to uphold that because you've had approval from that third-party independent. So there's a lot of ways that you could look at it. I think you could have a statewide intermediate unit for charter schools. You could have all kinds of different things, but asking a school district, especially if a school district has been deemed to be struggling, to now be the arbiter of what makes a great educational program is both unrealistic and unfair to that district and adds a burden that they shouldn't have to deal with.
Thank you very much for answering that. I appreciate it. I had one more question. I guess it's a comment and a quick question. Locally, so I represent an area in Middle Bucks County, and we've seen an increase in from mental health to a number of other factors, but we've seen an increase in the number of IEPs and just special education services. And I'm just wondering if you've seen a trend like that as well. Thank you.
Yes, and then our issue being in Philadelphia also is on top of all the other trauma that we've seen. You know, in the last 18 months, we've had 4 former students killed, 1 current student shot. And so that, in addition to all of the violence that's consistently going on, in addition to a pandemic, and in addition to everything else, is creating a significant amount of trauma, not just for students, but for their parents, and also for their teachers and their staff members. It's a lot. So we're seeing that increase as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Representative Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank everyone for their testimony today. I just have one question for each of you, if you don't mind. In terms of your budget, either as a percentage or a dollar amount, could you give a rough idea of how much of that is used for marketing and why that is necessary for each of your organizations and schools? Thank you.
So at PA Cyber, it's about 2% of our budget. You know, it's one of those things that, you know, we get accused of overspending. I'm like, well, if we can destroy the entire public education system for 2% of our budget, imagine what we could do for 5%. And not to make light of that, but that's how small of a percentage it is. But the law provides for it, to be honest, and it is a way that we make families aware that there are alternatives. I see advertising by traditional schools. Pittsburgh Public Schools does TV advertising because they have a magnet school system. All they're doing is letting families know that it exists. You'll see in real estate guides, you know, advertisements for school districts, you know, come here. But it's 2%, and it's mostly just to make families aware. I will tell you, the number one reason that people come to PA Cyber is family and friend referrals. You know, I think it's a little insulting to our families to think that a 30-second commercial, you know, at 8 o'clock in the morning is what drives families here. It's not. It's families who are thoughtful and concerned about their kids' education. They're sitting at church at a soccer game or something with their, you know, family and friends and say, you know, oh, my daughter's really struggling. What should we do? And they say, we go to PA Cyber, we go to Insight, whatever. So that's the answer, but it's very small for us.
Sorry, I don't remember the percent or the dollar amount off the top of my head, but I would say it's probably pretty similar to Mr. Hayden's percentage. And it's for similar purposes, too. It's to educate the families in the Commonwealth that they have the right to choose their child's public school education. That's what we talk about in our ads. We share our stories so that they can hear about a cyber school program and learn about it that way. I mean, again, there are other models across the United States where certain states have programs to promote all charter schools as an option so that they're then the individual schools don't need to do marketing. But we don't do that in Pennsylvania, which means the schools have to.
Yes. And as a brick and mortar, small brick and mortar, Mr. Wisman's my business manager also. So I kind of look back. I think we're at 0.0000, whatever number you want to put on it. Mm-hmm. Most of ours is family members. I can tell you I have a large number of of employees and students who I taught them when I was in the public district. We have other staff members who taught them, and then they come back, and the neighborhood comes back. That's the way we do it. But anything that we would do is if we have, just to make sure the law, I believe, says that we have to do at least one advertisement to let everybody know what our enrollment is and where we are.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, last question. Representative Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Us Joneses have to stick together, so I figured I had to come up and say something. You did an outstanding job. I wasn't surprised based on the name. You were clearly the two superior presenters today. I'm just kidding. Rep. Marcel actually saved me one question, which was kind of the role of the public school districts. And all of my kids are publicly educated, 4 of them. None of them all that bright, but they did okay. I was a school board member myself for a couple of years and all that, so I'm not, anti-public education, but obviously we have dramatic spectrum on how well those schools, the 501 or so, perform across the state and even within York County, where I'm from. I find it, going back to what Chairman Roy had said earlier, it would be comical if it weren't so serious and insulting that somehow the public schools, to your earlier point, sir, the parents have decided that the school's not working. They go to a charter school that they, in many instances, find a much better fit for the student, yet the public school, in some cases, the same failing public schools, are in a position to say whether or not that charter school maintains its charter or receives it in the first place. Are we implying that these parents are too stupid or unqualified to determine what's best for their children, and that they somehow need the local public school to come in and answer that for them? And that is somewhat a rhetorical question. With that said, I'll try to boil it down. It's kind of 2 or 3 questions, but it's all in the same vein. And that is, we were talking earlier about saying that when they evaluate the charter's performance, you've got disproportionate numbers of economically disadvantaged, disproportionate numbers of non-whites. Traditionally, the public schools, I don't want to stereotype because I don't think poverty and race are an excuse for failure. I think that's insulting as well. But traditionally, those would be excuses that many of the public schools use for poor performance. When they compare your performance to the public school, especially if it's maybe a better performing public school, and they try to say that your performance is not as good, how is that comparison done? Because I'm not really so much interested in that comparison. What I'm interested in is how the students that left the public school and went to your school, has their performance improved? Does that make sense? That's what's really relevant. So if I took just for the sake of discussion, so it's clear what I'm asking, let's just assume that the public school, trying to think of the politically correct, that the students average, they're B students on average. But if you're taking the D students and turning them into C students, that's a huge success, right? But when you compare it back to the B, you can say, well, no, you're not cutting. Are we actually comparing apples to apples, or is this an apples to oranges? And then for the sake of time, is there a problem that you experienced, Ms. Jones, in your case? Are the public schools still stonewalling on approvals and or, in your opinion, taking away charters that should not be taken away? And I'll leave it at that. But I'm curious what we're comparing.
The second part is so easy. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's impossible to open a charter school in Pennsylvania.
Even though we have huge demand from parents, right?
Correct.
By the way, many of these schools abandoned our kids 2 years ago during COVID when they wouldn't even open their doors, and they have no one to blame but themselves. But I'm getting into commentary, not questions. So
if I could just also jump on that. In Philadelphia, I had mentioned in testimony that there is an issue with the disparate treatment of minority-operated charter schools. It's so bad that the school board created has a law firm that is doing an independent investigation. That investigation has not come out yet, but the data is overwhelming. Despite having an independent investigation of a process that looks to be wrong, they doubled down on that process and recommended the closure of 2 minority-operated charter schools, one of which had just completed a $40 million bond deal to open a wonderful school with the neighborhood politicians. Everybody came out, probably many of the people in the House and Senate, colleagues of yours, and no one knew. And it was just done almost overnight. The school didn't even know that they were being put up for non-renewal. And these are the things that continue to happen because there is no accountability for those school boards. You know, you're not providing services to students with disabilities for 21 years, and there's no accountability. If I did that, I'd be fired and probably going to jail and beat up by Beth.
Well, to end, because we have to wrap up, your comment that these schools were intended to be innovative, to be reformers, not to be, over time, made to put back in the exact same mold of the public schools that the parents and the students, in some cases, are wanting to flee. And the Chick-fil-A and the McDonald's scenario example was 100% correct. Again, the notion that the school that you left is somehow going to tell you whether is going to have oversight over the school you've chosen to go to is insanity in my mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you all to the testifiers. This issue is a paramount issue for us. Education funding is absolutely critical. You guys brought great perspective, and we very much appreciate you coming here today. That is all for today. I did want to make mention of a couple of other things. One, there is a press conference that's going to be going on right outside. It'll be very brief, discussing this and other matters. 2, we are having another hearing Thursday in Butler County on workforce development. If you are planning on coming, which all of you are invited to, all the members are invited to, then please RSVP. 3, I just want to say thank you to my staff, Dan, Griffin, Taylor, and Leah. We have been very active and will be very active as we go forward. And thank you to those guys for putting in all this work. Also the video staff, you guys are traveling with us as well. There's a lot that goes into these, and I very much appreciate the work that everyone has put in. So that's all. Thank you for coming, and look forward to seeing everyone Thursday.